Otangelo, if I'm pronouncing that right, wants to know, what is the difference between a physicalist and an atheist?
Yeah, so an atheist you could think of as somebody, right, who does not think that there is a God. And then a physicalist, if we're talking about consciousness, you could have a physicalist account of consciousness and still think that God exists.
Right.
Okay. Now, let me clarify this a bit, because you might think, well, isn't God's consciousness not physical? So when philosophers focus on consciousness, a lot of times they'll narrow the scope to human consciousness. And so there are philosophers who are theists who would still be physicalists. So what they would say is that there's a physical world that God created, and out from that physical world comes all the other consciousness. That would be kind of form of physicalism.
Right.
You could perhaps get creative and even think that maybe even God has a kind of physicality. So even God's consciousness is physical. So that's at least a concept. There's some conceptual room for that, right?
Yeah.
You can also be an atheist and not a physicalist, right? So this goes back to what we were saying earlier in the show, which is that there's sort of this interesting survey where it shows that there's more atheists than physicalists among the philosophers of mind, at least on the previous survey that I saw there. And how does this work? Well, I think the way this works is, I'm thinking now of an atheist philosopher who once told me that he's a substance dualist, and is basically from the considerations we've been talking about. So he thinks that consciousness is not reducible to physical states, and there's more to you than matter.
Right.
But he's not thereby persuaded that reality itself has a fundamental supreme mind. And if I could just say something else about this, I mean, like Philip Goff, I think he would call himself at least agnostic, because even though he thinks he wouldn't call himself a physicalist, because he thinks that consciousness is prior, embedded within the material world, but he's not thinking that fundamental reality is organized into a supreme being.
Yes.